Margaret Thatcher is Britain's longest-serving Prime Minister, the first female leader of the Western world. During her 11 years in office, she sought to change Britain's way of life and its position on the international stage. Both revered and reviled in almost equal measure, she bestrode the political scene, both at home and abroad, with a passion and in a manner not seen before or since. But who was she? And where did she come from? And how did she come to power, first as leader of her party, and then as Prime Minister?
Mrs. Thatcher, it's always supposed to be a tremendous ordeal, maiden speech. Was it for you?
Margaret Thatcher was elected to Parliament as the member for Finchley in 1959. Aged 33, an Oxford graduate turned lawyer, married with twins, Mrs. Thatcher looked and sounded every inch the Tory lady.
There's been universal praise for your performance yesterday. Talk of the front bench. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think we'll just try to be a very good backbencher first. Certainly until these two are a little older, I couldn't take on any more political responsibilities. These responsibilities are quite enough.
But this was no girl from the affluent shires. Margaret Thatcher was a greengrocer's daughter from Grantham, whose father, Alderman Alfred Roberts, had fostered her early interest in politics.
Her father became the mayor of Grantham and was involved a great deal in local public life. And he took his daughter, his younger daughter, who is the one he obviously saw as, in a way, carrying on his tradition, almost a kind of son, with him where he went on public duties. So she was from a very early age, I think 13 or 14, sitting in on public meetings, watching her father conduct them, watching her father conduct council discussions and so on, and at the same time conscious of being very much loved by him.
Marriage to a man of means had enabled Mrs. Thatcher not just to establish a family, but to pursue her political ambitions.
I think Dennis was a very big influence on her. He encouraged her very much. He met her through politics, of course, and it was as a politician at the beginning of her career that they first got to know each other.
Just 2 years after her arrival in Parliament, Mrs. Thatcher was made a junior minister. Her promotion attracted much attention, though not necessarily for the right reasons.
But what's it going to mean in your home life? Obviously, you're going to have to make some adjustments.
I think it's going to mean even more organisation and method. I'm a great believer in those two things. But in any case, I could never do it were it not for the fact that my home is within 35 minutes of Westminster.
Yes.
I have an excellent nanny housekeeper, which helps immensely. But I see the children every morning, then they're at school all day, and of course I make a point of seeing and being with them at weekends.
If you run all the budgets in a race called the high taxation stakes, I am glad to say that Conservative budgets don't come in any of the first 4 places.
Off to a flying start, Margaret Thatcher was then appointed to the shadow front bench as a Treasury spokesperson after the Tories lost office in 1964.
The 4th prize to Callaghan in 1964. This chap Callaghan must go.
But it was following the 1970 Conservative election victory that Margaret Thatcher really came to public prominence. As Education Secretary in Edward Heath's cabinet, she put an end to free school milk.
I think the Labour Party decided very early on that they could hang this round her neck. Margaret Thatcher, milk snatcher. And she wasn't as tough as she later became. And I think for a period it had a very bad effect on her. The lady, the mother, who had snatched away the children's milk from them in schools. In fact, I think the proposal had been on the tapis in the Ministry of Education for some time. It wasn't a sudden revolution in policy. and it wasn't really her fault.
But having been dubbed by The Sun as the most unpopular woman in Britain, it was an early test of her mettle and character.
The criticism she received over the whole milk snatcher business, I think, was very unfair, but it was typical of the time, when it was felt that the government's role was to support everybody from cradle to grave. And much of Margaret Thatcher's thinking and policy later was to move us away from that idea to spending public money only on what was necessary, education, and not on what people should be providing for themselves, to a substantial degree, welfare, food for every child in the country, and so on. She would have been quite upset about the reaction. And Ted Heath was more than prepared, the Prime Minister today was more than prepared to let her take the blame, and indeed was on the point of dropping her. I suspect that some of that animosity between Heath and Thatcher actually impelled her to stand against him in due time.
Margaret Thatcher remained at education until the fall of Edward Heath's government in 1974. As such, she remained an observer watching from the sidelines as Edward Heath battled with the coal miners over pay rises. And as things started to fall apart in early 1974 with power cuts and the 3-day week, she was almost certainly out of the loop when it came to the decision by Heath to call an election based on the question, who governs Britain? The resounding reply of "not you" saw Margaret and the rest of the Tories back in opposition. Despite election defeat, Heath refused to resign. But it was not long before his leadership was being challenged, and almost by default, the challenge came from a woman.
She had not intended to be a candidate for leadership. Her man was Keith Joseph, and she was really shaken when Keith Joseph announced, for reasons which are well known, that speech he made in Birmingham, that he really wasn't the man to be Prime Minister. And she actually said to me, somebody representing our point of view has to stand. So I will stand. And she just felt that the party had to be off an alternative to Ted.
Margaret Thatcher beat Edward Heath by 130 votes to 119. It didn't give her victory, but it did mean she had a head start for the second round.
A lot of Conservatives wanted to punish him without pushing him out of the leadership, and persuaded that Mrs Thatcher could never win. Quite a block of members of Parliament, Conservative members of Parliament, voted for Margaret in order to give Ted Heath a shot across the bows that would make him behave better. They didn't want to see him go, certainly not for her.
So you fully expect your wife to be leading the Conservative Party, do you?
I do.
How do you feel about it?
Delighted. Terribly proud, naturally, wouldn't you?
Heath retired from the contest. Almost immediately, 4 of his former allies entered the fray. In doing so, they split the vote. But even taken together, they couldn't catch Thatcher. She won by 146 to William Whitelaw's 79 in February 1975.
When Mrs Thatcher followed, she looked as though she too was well content with the day's events. She's become accustomed to flashbulbs and arc lights over the last days, but after one last session of posing called a halt.
6, 5, 4.
Pleading a need to return to the committee stage of the finance bill and to tell Mr Thatcher all about it.
The old guard were totally shaken by her success. When she went to her first shadow cabinet meeting after she became leader, I've often thought about this. She sat down at the table knowing that virtually every single person around the table had not voted for her. They'd voted for somebody else, or they'd been candidates themselves. So it was quite a facer for her.
Margaret Thatcher had not expected to be leader of her party. She had once said that her ultimate ambition would be to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. But now, as leader, she was also aware of being an outsider, a factor that informed how she handled her leadership and her attitude towards her senior people. Insiders all.
I remember vividly her first appearance after her election on the dais at the end of the committee room to greet the 1922 committee, the assembled party. And there was a sense of history about it. I visualise it, this frail Joan of Arc-like woman arriving, and the Knights of the Shires on the platform beside her, looking deferential, and that was a change of mood and attitude. I don't think there was much sedition rumbling along. There were obviously some disappointed folk.
I think that they actually thought that it would be as it were, a 9-day wonder. And I don't think that they thought that she was ever going to win an election. In fact, I can remember in those early days, even after she became Prime Minister, the general assumption was that, she'd be a one-term inhabitant number 10.
Wary of those around her, she was also patronised by Labour MPs and even the then Prime Minister, James Callaghan.
If the Tory party were uncertain about Margaret Thatcher, and many of them were when she was Leader of the Opposition, the Labour government, the Labour Party, was equally uncertain of her. They took a very nasty and unpleasant approach to her in the House of Commons, catcalling, deriding her, using squeaking voices to try to humiliate her. They were very well organised at trying to undermine her confidence, and they pursued it to some pretty ferocious and unfriendly degrees. Jim Callaghan also used to patronise her across the dispatch box. And I remember her at times going into the House of Commons almost shaking with, not anxiety, but frustration, because she knew that she was going to go in there and receive a terrible battering on the part of the Labour Party, and perhaps not get the entire support of the Conservative Party behind her.
Where Margaret might struggle to maintain her supremacy within the parliamentary party, among grassroots Conservatives, her particular brand of bossy, no-nonsense politics and habitual references to good housekeeping made her a popular figure.
Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I presume this is to enable us to sweep Britain clean of socialism.
She enunciated very clearly the fight that most Tories were involved in and really wanted to see pursued with some energy, and that was the fight against creeping socialism.
Hello, dear. Of course. Have you been across?
The novelty of a woman as leader of the Tory party also lent Mrs. Thatcher a certain celebrity status.
Lovely dark red colour, isn't it? Much prettier than the House of Commons. It's half-term, dear. Can I borrow that to sign this one?
And, unusually for the leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher also attracted attention from abroad, most notably due to a speech she made in 1976, when she pronounced Russia as hell-bent on world domination. The Soviet news agency responded by labelling her the Iron Lady.
Mrs. Thatcher went very much against the grain of the Western world in the mid-70s on the whole question of the Soviet Union. This was an era of détente, and particularly President Carter was pushing it forward, and the SALT talks and all this sort of thing, and the Helsinki process. And Mrs. Thatcher was highly sceptical about this and was influenced by some rather unusual thinkers, some of whom were actually in Russia, such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, or came out of Russia, and others in the West, like Bob Conquest, who'd written all about the Great Terror and Stalin. And she wanted to sound the alarm about A, Soviet military expansion, and B, Soviet subversion in the West.
I stand before you tonight in my red star chiffon evening gown.
It was the start of the Soviets' fascination with Mrs. Thatcher, and inadvertently it gave her an identity as an international, not just domestic, politician. It was an image she would return to many times throughout her leadership.
The Iron Lady of the Western world.
She had the wit to see that this was the most wonderful gift to her, because what you need above all is recognition when you're the leader of the opposition. And there it was, the enemy had said she was the Iron Lady. They meant it as an insult. She took it, quite rightly, as a compliment.
Mrs. Thatcher's period as leader of the opposition also gave her an opportunity to fully develop the ideology she would then pursue in power.
We look back on her story now and we think she kind of blazed into the firmament, fully formed. And she didn't. It took several years in opposition, from 1975 to 79, when she began to do a lot of the thinking and commissioned a lot of the original thinking. All the political philosophy of the time was left-wing. There was nothing there. Margaret had to start doing it from scratch, and with the help of people like Keith Joseph and Alfred Sherman and the economists, she started to think through how you switch the economy from the very poor shape it was in, the sclerotic state it was in, into something much more dynamic.
She thought we have to rethink everything. This country is being ruined. It's being ruined by collectivism, socialism, inflation, too much trade union power, and by our own conservative failure to deal with these problems. And so that's what she started to think about. And in doing so, she combined a radicalism, that's to say a readiness to think of remedies that were quite different, for example, how she was going to tackle inflation, with a conservatism in the sense that she was wishing to bring back what she saw as traditional British qualities, which she felt had been sacrificed by socialism or by defeatism.
4 years into a Labour government and a string of bad by-elections had left Labour dependent on the Liberals and other parties to get their legislation through Parliament. The unions too were at war with the government over its attempt to keep pay rises below 5%. A winter of discontent in 1978 to early 1979, with public sector unions on strike, newspaper headlines about the dead being left unburied, and rubbish and rats on the streets, all contributed to Callaghan's woes. Margaret Thatcher was blunt in her assessment of the crisis and in her opinion of union activists and how they damaged the union cause.
Now, these few men are the wreckers in our midst. They're not the massive trade unionists, but there are a few militants who are the wreckers. And I think they do as much damage to the decent name of trade unionism as they do to our economy.
She perfectly understood that the trade unions should exist, that Labour needed representation at the workplace. But she was shocked by how ordinary trade unionists had almost no power because there was so little democracy in the system. And she was shocked by how that led to manipulation by the hard left. And she also believed that the trade unions, even when they were led by moderates, should not be making the economic policy of the country.
The collapse of the Lib-Lab Pact and the rejection of moves towards devolution in Scotland further weakened Callaghan's position and provided plentiful ammunition for Thatcher's campaign to bring down the government.
Tayside said no. Grampian said no. There is no sound or honourable basis for the great constitutional change which Labour have proposed. And the final insult would be for this dying government to try to bend our constitution to keep themselves in power for a few more wretched weeks.
On the 28th of March, 1979, Margaret Thatcher brought a vote of no confidence and won by 1 vote. James Callaghan was the first Prime Minister since Ramsay MacDonald in 1924 to be forced into an election by the Chamber. The result was far from a foregone conclusion, but the Thatcher gamble paid off. Callaghan sought the Queen's permission to dissolve Parliament as soon, he said, as a central business can be cleaned up.
You're looking very cheerful this morning. Are you in good spirits?
I always look forward to a good fight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Not physically, of course.
He was going down in the polls, and the people were saying he must stop these strikes, and this is terrible. They're getting worse and worse. And every time a strike was settled, a new strike would be announced the next day. It was a terrible period for him. And those who were his opponents couldn't be more delighted at the bad time he was having.
Following their success in defeating the government, there was jubilation in the Tory ranks, but not for long. On the 30th of March, Airy Neave was assassinated in the House of Commons car park.
Terrible news.
Margaret Thatcher's right-hand man, he'd encouraged her to go for the leadership and would have undoubtedly played a leading role in her government. But that was not to be.
He was one of freedom's warriors. No one knew what a great man he was, how great a man he was, except those nearest to him. He was staunch, brave, true, strong. But he was very gentle and kind and loyal. It's a rare combination of qualities. There's no one else who can quite fill them. I and so many other people owe so much to him. And now we must carry on for the things he fought for and not let the people who got him triumph.
We do, to that end, publish this our royal proclamation, and do hereby dissolve the said Parliament accordingly.
The election was finally announced on the 9th of April.
Good morning, Mrs.
Thatcher.
Mrs. Thatcher, can we have a little word about tactics before you go? Mr. Callaghan is off today in Scotland starting his campaign. Maybe perhaps ask you why you aren't doing the same.
Because we're just taking a little bit longer to plan. This is the longest campaign we've ever had. You know, in February 74, on October 74, we wouldn't even have had an election announced yet. And I'm just a little bit fearful that people might get fed up with us before the end of the campaign. And I think what's important is that you finish strongly.
Do you think you're giving him a head start at all?
As the campaign began, and despite Labour's loss of power, Callaghan was ahead of Margaret Thatcher in the opinion polls. But by now, the Conservative Party had on board an ex-TV producer, Gordon Rees, employed to promote the Tory brand.
When people now tend to blame people like Tony Blair and so on for introducing, quote, American electioneering tactics into British politics, not a bit of it. It was Gordon Rees and Margaret Thatcher. And between them, they decided that the old-fashioned way of doing things, the flinging of a Union Jack over a table in a village hall, wasn't good enough. And so he was fascinated to hear from me how the Americans had done it. And then particularly, he wanted to know what we in the television business would want during an election campaign. And we talked a lot about how we had to get to feed points and how we had to send things down the line, because this was the days before satellites were commonly used. This was astonishing. This was absolutely astonishing. I had never known any British political party really take any interest at all in what the media wanted. It was normally a case up to then of what the media was going to get.
Mrs. Thatcher, too, did her best to display her prodigious energy, racing around the country on a ceaseless exercise in self-promotion.
Come right round, man.
Now listen, I'm not standing for 20 minutes now.
Everywhere she went, she was regarded not with love and affection, but with curiosity and interest. And the crowds would come out. Maggie would go into a high street and the crowds would instantly come out. It was very significant at that time that when Jim Callaghan did the same, went on walkabout, that he didn't get the same sort of response. People would be ignoring him or simply not showing the same sort of curiosity about him. And it wasn't so much a matter of politics at the time, it was a matter of personality. She had a different personality, a personality with a rough edge, a sharp edge, but that seemed to fascinate people too, and they responded.
During the election campaign, Mrs. Thatcher said the Conservatives would cut income tax, reduce public expenditure, make it easier for people to buy their own homes, and curb the power of the unions.
You know, I just think it's simply terrible for people listening to us when you put a similar question to each of the party leaders and they all say, yes, 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 we're very confident. So I say we've got very good grounds to be optimistic.
The 79 election was quite cautious and a great deal centred on just the state of the public finances and the state of public debts. The balance of payments, which always featured far too much in economic conversation then, and the general air of malaise in the country. But the idea we set out, Margaret set out, a fiercely sort of free market, liberal, capitalist agenda, is a complete myth. We'd have lost even to Jim Callaghan if we'd done that at the time.
A lot of the language of opposition when you are trying to get into government has to be reassurance. And people forget at this distance how much of the language of Margaret Thatcher in the 70s was reassurance, that Conservatives could live with trade unions. There was very little mention of privatisation in the 1970s. She went out of her way not to scare the electorate.
Plainclothes police out of a car behind her. Mrs. Thatcher out onto the doorstep.
On the 4th of May, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister with a Commons majority of 43 seats. On arriving at Downing Street, she made one of the most memorable, if not universally well-received speeches of her prime ministerial career.
It's the greatest honour that can come to any citizen in a democracy. I know full well the responsibilities that await me as I enter the door of number 10, and I'll strive unceasingly to try to fulfil the trust and confidence that the British people have placed in me and the things in which I believe. And I would just like to remember some words of St. Francis of Assisi, which I think are really just particularly apt at the moment. Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
St. Francis of Assisi, the lines that she used outside of Downing Street were not her lines, and of course they didn't represent her feelings at all, her real feelings. She didn't know what to say on the doorstep. She wanted ideas, and one of her greatest colleagues and friends and her speechwriter, Ronnie Miller, who was a wonderful playwright, came up with these lines for her. They were lines which would have done for any politician, for any Prime Minister. Sadly, they weren't the lines that really reflected Maggie Thatcher, but they did for the moment, and did rather well, got a lot of notoriety, and were then put in the drawer and forgotten.
The girl from Grantham had travelled a long way. It was an astonishing achievement. The first female leader of a British political party was now Prime Minister. She had risen from nowhere to the top of what was a man's world. She had defeated her own prediction of how far a woman could travel in politics.
Well, she's now doing an almost papal handshake, going down Downing Street, shaking every hand that she can possibly get hold of. There is great enthusiasm.
Her election had captured the imagination at home and sparked enormous interest abroad. The first female leader of the Western world had assumed power, and little did anyone fully appreciate it then, but a new political era had truly begun. Her victory barely absorbed, Margaret Thatcher set about choosing her first cabinet. There was a balance to be struck between the right and left wings of the party. With economic policies seen both as the priority and the dividing line, she made sure that economic departments were kept under control, with her most loyal allies getting the top jobs. Her first appointment was Geoffrey Howe as Chancellor. Many thought the job would go to her ideological mentor, Keith Joseph.
Keith Joseph was a very thoughtful, original, and in certain respects completely useless politician. So this was very good for her because he posed no threat to her, but he did constantly supply her with ideas, and he got her to think about things. And one of his great skills was to find interesting people who had ideas about economics, trade union reform, and so on. And he encouraged, through a body called the Centre for Policy Studies, which he set up with her assisting, all this the power of ideas, to mobilise the power of ideas.
Economic teams in place, the next surprise appointment was that of Jim Pryor as Employment Secretary. A close ally of Edward Heath, he had also forged good relations with a number of trade union leaders.
But on the other hand, we've also got some pretty nasty pills to come, because one of the things that's happened over the last few months is that a number of decisions in shipbuilding and steel and coal and in other heavy industries have not been taken.
Mrs. Thatcher wanted to reform the trade unions and employment practices, and the only argument was over how fast she could do it. She reckoned that the unions would be prepared to deal with Pryor.
Jim Pryor was actually sympathetic to the unions. I think he felt pragmatically that if you wanted to make change in industrial relations in Britain, you couldn't do it with a big hammer.
Of other notable appointments, Willie Whitelaw became Home Secretary. Although one of the old guard, he became Thatcher's right-hand man and the person who advised her on how to run the country and on how to present policies.
He could contribute very little in the way of policy ideas. He wasn't that sort of man. What he could do was give shrewd judgment about political situations, and he could deliver opinion. He could reach bits of the Tory tribe, which Mrs. Thatcher couldn't. And he did that loyally and skillfully. And and in a way which combined sort of apparent bumbling with actual cunning.
Elsewhere, Michael Heseltine was made Secretary at Environment, Peter Walker was given Agriculture, and Lord Carrington was appointed her first Foreign Secretary.
Mrs Thatcher understood very well when she came into office that she was in charge of a coalition, in effect, and that she had to get the balance of power right. And though she was a woman of strong beliefs, she was not an ideological maniac, so she well understood practical politics. And she also, if you talk to people who were there when she was trying to select the cabinet, she did not say, is he one of us, does he agree with us on everything? That wasn't the way she thought about it. She thought about their skills, their experience, the overall balance in the party.
Cabinet appointed, now it was time to set about the job of change. The first announcement came just a day after the Queen's speech. Michael Heseltine informed MPs that local authorities would be able to sell council houses to tenants for at least 30% below the market value.
The whole policy depended on a discount being given. I remember Margaret being quite iffy about all this. Not at a cabinet meeting, I wasn't at the cabinet committee, but I remember privately picking up that she didn't like the idea of people being given assets at less than their full value. And she had to be talked into agreeing to that. And it was Peter Walker who was the real enthusiast. Peter Walker at one point actually wanted to go further. Peter left himself would have given them away.
We do happen to think that spreading ownership and giving people the opportunity to own their own homes is a major central policy of the Conservative government, and we cannot allow local authorities to sort of frustrate the views and the wishes of the British democratic process.
It had a tremendous impact, the plan to sell council houses to their sitting tenants. There's some dispute over who should get the credit for it. Michael Heseltine, who was at that stage, I think, Shadow Secretary of State for the Environment and had just gone into the government, claims it was his idea. I think the more loyal supporters of Mrs Thatcher would dispute that and say, no, it was the Prime Minister's. But be that as it may, the fact is it had a tremendous impact. And I remember a very bright Labour MP at the time, Brian Walden, saying to me, this is going to be lethal to us. It's going to be lethal, Tony, I'm telling you. You know, what it's going to do to us in those sort of places like Essex. And he was absolutely right. It had, I think, more electoral effect than any other single measure that first government of hers took. And it really lost the Labour Party great swathes of support on the places where they'd always been confident to be able to keep it, which was on the council estates.
It was an authentic application of their belief, their ideology, their doctrine at the time, but it also had enormous immediate electoral benefits.
Next came the budget on the 12th of June. Income tax was the big headline, and the shift from direct to indirect taxation. The basic rate was cut from 33% to 30%, and the top rate from 83% to 60%. To make up the shortfall, VAT was increased.
Everyone recognised we had to make this big change in the shape as much as the size of taxes. It was a great blessing we had. And if you take tax policy in particular, in every speech I made in opposition, I ended a paragraph by saying, pay as you spend is better than pay as you earn. It always got a round of applause. In my very first budget, I reduced the top rates of income tax a lot. I knocked threepence off income tax, but I almost doubled value-added tax.
In addition, the government announced a £3.5 billion cut in public spending.
I think that some of our colleagues, and indeed even we, didn't realise just how tough it was going to be. But the condition that was always dominant, if we were borrowing money still in order to finance expenditure we couldn't afford, we had to pay interest rates to borrow it. And the market wouldn't let us borrow more except at higher interest rates. So we had to follow monetary policy by reducing our borrowing. It was really, there is no alternative.
Geoffrey Howe's first budget would pave the way for monetarism in Britain.
It was a huge nominal change, and that meant that everything went up in price, and that meant that wages went up because everything was still very stratified. And it caused all sorts of problems with the exchange rate and with public spending, and it undoubtedly contributed to the difficulties. And there was quite a row about that within the cabinet before it happened, and there was unhappiness about it in the country. But the feeling that Geoffrey Howe had, who really carried the day on that more than her, was that if you don't do it now, you'll never do it, and we must make this big step.
The budget sent out a clear signal of a government, and particularly a Prime Minister, eager to get things done. And it wasn't just spending at home. Margaret Thatcher was also concerned to reduce the size of Britain's contribution to the European Community budget.
They don't agree with talk of summit deadlines or permanent changes in the common market rules to help Britain, as the French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Chesson, told me.
I'm afraid that when Britain say there should be now a new permanent regulation, rule, that we cannot accept. But I'm ready, as member of the French government, to say we accept that during that transition some adjustment should be made in the budgetary contribution.
It would be almost a year before a first reduction would be achieved. It marked a 2/3 cut in the size of Britain's net contribution to the EC budget and the promise of a major review of that contribution the following year.
She didn't really feel that was quite enough, so she was quite angry about that. But actually it was rather good, if the truth be told. But the fact remains that had she not been there and been absolutely adamant in getting that, it wouldn't have happened. I mean, she would, of course, she annoyed a lot of people. I mean, Helmut Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing used to get rather frustrated by her on the budget, but the fact is that she was absolutely right.
Thatcher's next battle was over the trade unions. She was determined the events of the winter of discontent would not be repeated. Radical reform of trade union law, therefore, was of the utmost priority. Jim Pryor was in charge of introducing the appropriate legislation. But as was evident from his earlier dealings with the unions, he was not one for extreme measures.
Many of the provisions of these codes have been contained in previous TUC or Transport and General Workers Union codes. Now, I think that most people want to see some reasonable discipline in both the closed shop and the way it operates and in picketing.
Jim Pryor was not one to have a head-to-head. He much preferred the step-by-step approach, which became the very famous strapline of his approach.
In autumn 1979, Jim Pryor was ready with an employment bill that outlawed secondary picketing, limited the closed shop, and imposed compulsory ballots before action. It was a sizable package, but in Mrs. Thatcher's eyes it didn't go far enough.
What Jim wanted was to have a measure that would stick. Because don't forget, nobody at this point knew that Margaret Thatcher was going to be Prime Minister for 11 years. There was this feeling, well, would she get re-elected? And Jim's argument was always, well, let's do things which are so blatantly, obviously right that a Labour government wouldn't repeal them if it got the chance.
In the face of Mrs. Thatcher's impatience, and as if to test Jim Pryor's resolve, on the 2nd of January 1980, a national strike began at the National Steel Corporation. The steel workers were demanding a 20% pay rise. The management had offered a 6% increase with tough conditions attached.
The Steelworkers Trade Union, who were my best client, I practiced at the bar, a union which my grandfather helped to found. So one had a great deal of sympathy with them in the difficult situation. But they decided to go ahead. And all we could do was to support the British Steel Corporation. There were some non-nationalised steel companies still in existence, and they were able to trade alongside the strike, so the strike was always unlikely to succeed.
The strike lasted nearly 14 weeks. The plants reopened after the Lever inquiry recommended a package worth 16% in return for an agreement on working practices and productivity deals. Throughout, the government maintained a position of non-intervention, leaving management to manage. But Margaret Thatcher and her allies also made it clear they opposed the action of the unions.
The steel strike was considered to be a win on points for the government. And the reason for this is that though it's true that the sum was much larger than the government wanted, the government had managed to sustain its determination to not to intervene. The great way the unions worked with all the nationalised industries was to create such a rumpus that the people who ran the nationalised industries had to sort of crumple and the government had to come in and sort it out. And the government didn't do that.
The strike had put added pressure on Pryor to take a tougher line in his union reform. As it was, Pryor kept his bill intact.
Margaret always felt that Jim was too cautious. She wanted to move more quickly. But the interesting thing was when Norman Tebbit took over from Jim, he was quite cautious too. He moved rather more slowly than she would have expected him to. And he, in a funny way, although he was a different character from Jim, shared the same view. It was very important to have laws that would stick, rather than play to the gallery and throw in the kitchen sink and give the Labour Party the excuse to repeal them.
A similar challenge to the government was British Leyland, of which Margaret Thatcher would later write, "The company had become a symbol of Britain's industrial decline and of trade union bloody-mindedness."
A lot of them didn't think of me, but having said that...
Once again, workers were on strike.
This cut back in numbers for purely financial reasons as a result of government economic policy, which makes it very difficult for the company to exist at all, is being dealt with in an arrogant and dogmatic fashion by the company.
I remember very well her attitude to British Leyland. First of all, she was absolutely furious with Michael Edwards. I mean, when he came along and effectively asked for £1 billion. And, you know, this was against every instinct that she had. But this was where Margaret was so pragmatic. Margaret knew that the Midlands was full of small and medium-sized companies that made their living by supplying British Leyland.
So, for all Margaret Thatcher's talk of non-intervention in saving failing industries, political expediency overcame government reluctance to provide support. In agreeing to the British Leyland corporate plan, the government also committed itself to providing a further £990 million of state funding.
She made it quite clear that this could never be prayed in aid as a precedent. It was a one-off, and don't come to her and say you did it for British Leyland, now do it for me. And this was where she was very clever. She knew she wanted to get from A to B. She knew you couldn't always get there in a straight line, but she never lost sight, even if you made a detour, of where she was aiming to be at the end.
If Thatcher was unable to prevent industrial unrest in the country, she was also to experience dissent within her own government. Rising unemployment, high inflation and cuts in public spending had split the cabinet. The lines were drawn between Thatcher and her economic team and those who opposed her economic strategy.
It got very personal, you know. I remember once one of the Wets went to lunch in the city, and he was reported to have said, the Conservative Party is a cavalry regiment led by a corporal in the Women's Royal Army Corps. And of course this silly man who made that remark thought he could say these things. She'd heard about it within 2 hours because people thought it was a very disloyal remark. And that was an extreme example, but he wasn't the only person with an attitude akin to that.
The cabinet battle would reach its zenith the following year when Chancellor Geoffrey Howe announced his first fully fledged monetarist budget, just at the time the country was in the grip of the deepest recession since the 1930s.
Their great, I suppose, set-piece battle was over the 1981 budget, which people say was sort of sprung on the Cabinet. But the fact is, the Cabinet doesn't discuss budgets, never has. Budget's always been a matter between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And it's true that they only had 24 hours notice of it. That's practically always been the case. But some people, including Francis Pym, who was very senior in the party, wasn't yet Foreign Secretary, leader of the House of Commons, saying they were terribly affronted at being told that this, really repressive budget was being brought in. Now, Geoffrey Howe was absolutely equally responsible for it as Margaret Thatcher, and I suppose history did in the end vindicate them.
Cabinet battles and industrial unrest would also presage the burgeoning unpopularity of the Thatcher government.
By 1981, we were so unpopular, it was extraordinary. I was quite convinced as a junior minister in 1981, not only that we'd lose the next election, but I was beginning to doubt whether the Conservative Party would survive as a national party, because the public so yearned for those comfortable days when governments used to buy their way out of trouble only a few years before.
The 1981 budget so alarmed many academics that it prompted 364 leading university economists to publish a statement taking issue with the government's macroeconomic policy.
There's no basis in economic theory to indicate that this would be a permanent way of bringing inflation under control, and also that this would lead automatically to a recovery of output and employment.
I think it was very encouraging to get the 364 economists, because I think it put her on her mettle. And she noticed, as soon as the letter was published, that it didn't have any proposals. It had a criticism, but not a set of proposals. And the famous phrase, of course, about the whole economic approach of the Thatcher government, a phrase actually developed by Geoffrey Howe, not by her, is "there is no alternative." And this rather rammed that home. They didn't have an alternative. They had an attack, but not an alternative.
But if the critics thought they could persuade her to abandon her chosen economic course, they were mistaken. 6 months earlier, at the Tory party conference in October 1980, Margaret Thatcher had made it quite clear she would not be deflected from reforming fiscal policy in the manner she saw fit.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It was really aimed at Ted and quite a gang in the shadow cabinet who were putting her under a lot of pressure to say, you can't have rising unemployment, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, we've got to change policy. And so the message to that was to them, you change if you will, but this lady is not for turning. And it was a clear message because in the summer of that year, you know, the cabinet had rebelled and wouldn't approve of her and Geoffrey's plans. And so she made that change, and she said, you know, it was deliberate. We were elected to carry out a series of promises in our manifesto, and I'm going to do it. And I'm not going to be driven off course by internal opposition.
If ever the Prime Minister had been haunted by doubts, she did not show it. Thatcher gave a bravura performance expressing confidence in her own judgment and even generosity towards dissenters.
Nevertheless, never mind, it's wet outside. I expect they want it to come in. You can't blame them. It's always better where the Tories are.
Thatcherism had been born. Her approach to economic reform, public spending and the trade unions were now well established. She'd grown in stature and become more self-assured. Her self-belief seemed stronger than ever.
She was always knowing where she wanted to be, where she wanted to get to, and was plotting and planning to find the right way to get there. Willing to take risks in order to get there, particularly with her own job, and indeed at times with her own life. But always conscious of the fact that there was a long-term game to play. She was not just a politician, she was a statesman with a long-term view.
Let us stand together and do our duty, and we shall not fail.
In the moment of Thatcherism's birth, its leader had also to face terrorism and engage in international diplomacy. But it was her actions at home on the economic front that would come to define the beginning of the Thatcher years. In the next programme, A Distant War in the Falklands helps transform the Prime Minister's flagging fortunes at home.
You can order Margaret Thatcher, a tribute in words and pictures, for the special half-price fee of £10. Call Telegraph Books on 0870 155 7222 or order online at www.books.telegraph.co.uk.